My brother stood up in that conference room and said, "She doesn't belong here. She never did." I didn't flinch. I didn't look at him. I just kept my hands flat on the table and watched the window behind his head, where the Chicago skyline sat gray and indifferent, the way it always does in November. I'd been waiting 3 years for that moment. I wasn't going to waste it by reacting. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning is not pretty. My name is Vivienne. I'm 31 years old. I'm the only daughter of Harold and Louise Ashworth. Harold, who built Ashworth Medical Supply from a single warehouse in Naperville into a mid-size regional distributor with $11 million in annual revenue, and Louise, who died of ovarian cancer when I was 19 and left behind a grief so clean and quiet in my father that it eventually curdled into something else entirely, something that looked a lot like my brother. My brother's name is Grant. He's 37, 6 feet tall, and has the kind of confidence that gets mistaken for competence at family dinners and board presentations alike. He started working for our father's company at 22, straight out of a state school with a business degree and a handshake. I started working there at 24 after finishing a dual degree in supply chain management and healthcare administration at Northwestern. My father put Grant in charge of operations. He put me in charge of operations. He put me in charge of ordering office supplies. I'm not exaggerating. My official title for the first 8 months was Procurement Coordinator, Internal Resources. I ordered printer cartridges and coffee pods and replacement chairs for the break room. I didn't complain. I learned the company instead. Every invoice, every vendor contract, every distribution agreement, I read them all. I knew our margins better than our CFO. I knew which of our supplier relationships were hemorrhaging money and which ones were quietly making us. I stayed late. I came in early. I asked questions that made people uncomfortable, and then quietly went away and found the answers myself. My father noticed, or I thought he did. When I was 27, he promoted me to Director of Strategic Partnerships. It was a real title, a real salary, a real office with a window. Grant was furious. He didn't say so at dinner. He never said anything directly, but I started finding my proposals buried in committee. My emails went unanswered for days before getting forwarded to Grant for alignment review. The vendor I'd spent 6 months cultivating for a new Pacific Northwest distribution deal was suddenly assigned to Grant's team with no explanation. I asked my father about it once. Just once. He looked at me across the kitchen table the way he used to look at my mother when she asked him about something he didn't want to discuss. Patient, a little tired, a little dismissive, and said, "Grant has more experience on the operational side. He understands the relationships." I nodded. I went home. I started making different plans. This is the part nobody in my family knew about. For 2 years, while I was still drawing a salary from Ashworth Medical Supply, I was also building something on the side. I didn't cry when I got the knife end in a night event. She was a healthcare procurement consultant with 20 years of experience and a client list that read like a who's who of mid-size hospital systems in the Midwest. We started talking. Then we started meeting for coffee. Then we started building a business model together on the backs of napkins, and then in a shared Google Doc, and then, eventually, with a lawyer and an LLC and a bank account. Ashworth Osei Procurement Partners. My name came first because I put in the initial capital, $240,000 that I'd been saving since my first paycheck. Money I'd never touched because I'd always known I was going to need it for something real. I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell Grant. The company was fully above board. I wasn't competing with Ashworth Medical Supply. I was operating in a different segment entirely, advising hospital systems on their supply chain strategy rather than actually distributing product. No conflict of interest. I had a lawyer review it twice. I wasn't hiding it because it was illegal. I was keeping it quiet because I knew what would happen the moment my family found out. They would try to take it. By the time I'd been running AOPP for 18 months, we had 4 full-time employees, 6 active hospital system clients, and a revenue run rate of just under $2 million annually. Patricia handled business development. I handled operations and strategy. We were good together. We were building something real. Then, my father had a stroke. He survived. His recovery was long and difficult and left him with partial weakness on his right side and a kind of cognitive fog that came and went unpredictably. He was never going to run the company again, and everyone knew it. What nobody had officially decided was what happened next. Grant decided for everyone. Within 2 weeks of my father's hospital discharge, Grant had called an emergency shareholders meeting. Ashworth Medical Supply had 3 shareholders of note, my father at 60%, Grant at 22%, and me at 18%. Grant had been quietly buying shares from a small group of early investors over the preceding year, something I only discovered afterward, which brought his total to 31%. Still not a majority, but enough, combined with my father's proxy, to control any vote, except that my father hadn't actually given Grant his proxy. Grant had assumed he would. He'd been managing my father's affairs since the stroke, the medical appointments, the prescriptions, the household bills. He'd positioned himself as the dutiful son, the capable one, the obvious choice. He'd shown my father documents. He'd explained things slowly and patiently, in the way you explain things to someone whose cognition you've quietly decided is no longer reliable. What Grant didn't know, what nobody knew, was that 3 months before my father's stroke, I'd had a long, clear-headed conversation with him at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. He'd seemed tired that day, more reflective than usual. He'd asked me about my company, the one he'd found out about from a mutual business acquaintance. I told him everything. He'd listened without interrupting. When I finished, he'd been quiet for a long time. Then he'd said, "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Vivian. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." We'd had his attorney draft documents that afternoon. My father had given me his full legal proxy for any and all corporate decisions in the event of his incapacitation. He'd also updated his estate plan to reflect a more equitable distribution of his interest in the company. Grant received copies of nothing. So when Grant called that emergency shareholders meeting and stood at the head of the conference table in our father's building, the one with the frosted glass and the Ashworth Medical Supply logo etched into the window, and announced that he would be assuming the role of CEO and that the board should ratify his appointment immediately, I sat quietly at the other end of the table. I had a folder in front of me. I didn't open it. Our outside board member, a retired healthcare executive named Robert Cheswick, who had known our family for 15 years, was running the meeting. He was visibly uncomfortable. He kept glancing at me. Grant was not glancing at me. Grant was talking. Grant had been talking for 11 minutes straight about his vision for the company, his operational expertise, his relationship with key vendors, his plan to take the company in a new direction. He used the word pivot 4 times. He talked about synergies. He said the company needed strong, decisive, experienced leadership, and then looked directly at me when he said it, as if I wouldn't notice. Then our uncle, my father's younger brother, who held a minor advisory role and had always been Grant's loudest cheerleader, stood up and said, "I think we can all agree that Grant is the natural choice here. He's been running operations for years. He knows this company inside and out." He paused and smiled in my direction with the kind of smile men use when they think they're being magnanimous. "Vivienne is talented, of course, but she's young. And frankly, a company going through a transition like this needs someone steady, someone who's been here." I had been there for 7 years. I kept my hands flat on the table. Robert Cheswick cleared his throat. "Before we move to any vote, I think we should address the question of Harold's proxy. Grant, you mentioned that your father has authorized you to act on his behalf. Can you provide that documentation?" Grant smiled. He opened his own folder. He slid a document across the table, a power of attorney form dated 6 weeks earlier, signed with my father's signature. I picked it up. I looked at it. I set it back down. "That's a general power of attorney for healthcare and financial management," I said. "It doesn't extend to corporate governance or shareholder voting authority. Those require a separate proxy instrument." Grant's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "It's broad enough," he said. "It isn't," I said. I opened my folder. I slid my document across the table. This is a durable corporate proxy executed by Harold Ashworth 3 months before his stroke, notarized, witnessed, and filed with the company's registered agent. It assigned full shareholder voting rights for all corporate matters to me in my capacity as his designated representative for the duration of any period of incapacity. The room went very quiet. Grant stared at the document. His lawyer, a young associate named Philip from a downtown firm who had been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, suddenly sat up straight. "This is the first time I'm seeing this," Grant said. "It was filed appropriately," I said. "You didn't ask. Dad would never." He stopped. He looked at the signature. He looked at the notary stamp. He looked at the filing date. He wasn't in his right mind 3 months before the stroke. This could be challenged. "On what basis?" Robert Cheswick said quietly. Grant didn't answer. I went on. I was careful to keep my voice level, the way you keep your voice when you've rehearsed something so many times it's become muscle memory rather than performance. "I also want to note for the record that I've been conducting a review of the company's vendor contracts over the past 60 days. I produced another document. In 2023, a sole source distribution contract was awarded to a logistics company called Morrow Transit Solutions. No competitive bid process, no board approval. The contract was signed by Grant in his capacity as COO. I set the document on the table. Morrow Transit Solutions is 50% owned by a holding company registered in Delaware. That holding company has a single listed manager, Grant's college roommate, whose name appears nowhere in the vendor disclosure records. More quiet. "That's a related party transaction," I said. "It wasn't disclosed. It wasn't approved. Under our operating agreement, it's a breach of fiduciary duty." Grant's lawyer was no longer taking notes. He was very still. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Grant said. His voice had dropped to something lower, something that wasn't quite steady. "You've been out there building your own little company, running around with your consultant friend. You abandoned this family. You abandoned this business." "I diversified," I said. "There's a difference. Dad was going to give me this company." He was looking at me directly now, and something had cracked open in his expression. Not remorse, nothing like that, but a kind of animal desperation that I recognized because I had seen it before. On the night of our mother's funeral, when he'd asked our father for her jewelry to give to a girlfriend, and our father had quietly said no. He was going to give it to me. It was always supposed to be mine. "He gave me his proxy," I said. "That's what he decided. You manipulated him. You got to him before." "Before what?" I said. "Before you did." He had no answer for that. Robert Cheswick spoke carefully. "Given the documentation Vivienne has presented, I don't think we can proceed with any leadership vote today. I'd recommend we adjourn and allow both parties to consult with counsel before reconvening." He looked at Grant's lawyer. "I'd also recommend your client take seriously the fiduciary exposure outlined in this document." Philip gathered his papers with the particular speed of someone who wants to be somewhere else. Grant didn't move for a moment. He sat at the head of the table he had positioned himself at, in the chair he had chosen, in the room he had arranged for a meeting he had called, and he looked at the documents in front of him, and then he looked at me. "She doesn't belong here," he said. And I think he was saying it to Robert, to our uncle, to the room, to the furniture, to anyone who might still agree with him. "She never did." I said nothing. Our uncle had gone very quiet. He was studying the wood grain of the table. Robert Cheswick stood up. "I'll be in touch with both parties' legal representatives by end of week." He picked up his copy of my proxy document. He looked at it once more before folding it into his jacket pocket. Then he said, quietly, more to himself than anyone, "Harold always did know what he was doing." The weeks that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that because these things never resolve in a single afternoon, no matter how good the documents are. Grant's attorney filed a challenge to the proxy on the grounds of undue influence. It went nowhere. My father's personal attorney, who had drafted the document himself and whose notes reflected a clear-eyed, detailed conversation with my father, provided testimony that made the challenge untenable. The neurologist who had been treating my father confirmed that 3 months prior to the stroke, Harold Ashworth had been cognitively intact. The Morrow Transit matter was referred to the board's audit committee, which retained outside counsel. The investigation took 6 weeks. It confirmed the undisclosed relationship. Grant's attorney negotiated a settlement that included his resignation from the company and repayment of a portion of the contract value. No criminal referral, which I thought was too lenient, but sometimes you take the outcome you can get rather than the one you wanted. I became interim CEO in January. My father came to the office once in March, on a Thursday morning when the light was coming in flat and gold through the east windows. I hadn't told him I was coming. He came in a wheelchair, pushed by his physical therapist, wearing a sweater I recognized from when I was 12. He sat in the lobby for a while, just looking around at the space, the logo on the wall, the reception desk, the photographs of the warehouse and the delivery trucks that lined the hallway. I sat with him for an hour. We didn't talk much. He asked me how things were going. I told him when I call my Fardini Fry Babanekli on. He nodded slowly. Before he left, he put his good hand over mine on the armrest of his wheelchair. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Patricia and I merged AOPP with the company's advisory function in April. It made structural sense, and the combined entity was stronger than either piece separately. Patricia is now our chief strategy officer. She has an office down the hall from mine. She drinks too much coffee and has very strong opinions about color-coded spreadsheets, and I've never been more grateful for anyone's company in my professional life. Grant and I haven't spoken since the meeting. I don't expect that to change. There's a version of this story where I tried harder to preserve the relationship, where I found a softer path. I've thought about that version. I understand why people want it to exist. But I also remember every time I sat in a conference room and watched my work get handed to him. Every vendor meeting I was excluded from. Every time I ordered coffee pods instead of closing deals. Every time my father looked at me with that tired patience and told me Grant understood the relationships. I understood the relationships too. I just also understood the numbers, the filings, the contracts, the legal exposure, and the 3-month window between a Sunday afternoon conversation at a kitchen table and a stroke that nobody saw coming. My mother used to say that the most dangerous thing a woman can be is quiet and prepared. She said men would always assume the quiet meant nothing was happening. She was right. The Chicago skyline is the same gray and indifferent it always is in November. I have a window now, a real one, and I don't have to share the view with anyone who doesn't deserve to see it. I still think about that Sunday afternoon at my father's kitchen table sometimes. The light was coming in through the side window the way it does in late September, low and a little gold. And my father had his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he wasn't really drinking. He looked tired, not sick, not yet. Just the kind of tired that settles into a person when they've been carrying something for a long time without putting it down. What I've come to understand, looking back, is that every outcome in that boardroom was already written years before Grant ever called that meeting. Not by luck, not by fate in any mystical sense. Just by choices, his and mine, compounding quietly over time, the way interest compounds in an account nobody's watching. Grant made his choices too. He chose to assume. He chose to mistake proximity for preparation, volume for vision, a handshake for a strategy. He moved through that company for 15 years, genuinely believing that confidence was the same thing as competence, and that being seen was the same thing as being ready. When the moment came, he had the posture of someone who'd won, but not the foundation. And foundations are the only thing that matter when the weight finally lands. I made different choices. I stayed quiet not because I was weak, but because I was watching. I learned every contract, every relationship, every number. Not because someone told me to, but because I understood that knowledge is the only leverage that can't be taken from you at a dinner table or a board vote. I built something outside those walls because I knew, I think I always knew, that the door they were keeping half closed for me was not the only door in the building. That kind of patience is hard. I won't pretend it isn't. There were nights I wanted to walk into my father's office and say everything I'd been swallowing for years. There were meetings where I sat across from my brother and watched him get credit for work I'd done, and I had to make a deliberate choice every single time about what I was building toward and whether burning it down in that moment was worth it. It never was. My mother was an exceptionally decent person. She was honest in small ways as much as large ones. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't flatter people she didn't respect. She didn't take shortcuts on things that mattered. I watched her do that my whole childhood without fully understanding what I was watching. She wasn't performing integrity. She just lived inside it, the way you live inside a house. It became structural. It held things up. I think she gave that to me in the way she gave me her nose and her stubbornness, not by teaching it explicitly, but by making it the atmosphere of my early life. What I know now is that who you are in the years nobody's watching is exactly who you'll be when everyone is. Grant was the same man in that boardroom that he'd been for 15 years in hallways and vendor calls and conversations with our father when he thought I wasn't listening. And I was the same woman who'd spent 7 years learning the things she loved well enough to protect it. The proxy document didn't save me, I saved me. Years before I ever sat down at that table. The document just made it official. Patricia said something to me after, over very bad airport coffee on a Tuesday morning when we were flying out to meet a new client. She said, "The thing about doing the work is that it's boring right up until it isn't." She was right. It's mostly boring. Most of it is reading contracts at 10 o'clock at night and asking questions people find inconvenient and building things slowly when everyone around you is moving fast. And then one day someone opens a folder in a conference room and the room goes quiet and all those boring years are suddenly standing right behind you. That's not a miracle. That's just math.